The city was new to me, a sprawling concrete beast that had already chewed up a fair portion of my savings before I'd even found a place to consistently lay my head. My job, a decidedly unglamorous position cataloging digitized municipal records for a private archiving firm, was the reason for the move. It was mostly solitary work, often involving late hours, which, I suppose, made me less of a desirable tenant in some of the more vibrant residential areas. What I needed was cheap, quiet, and within a commutable distance from the downtown office. What I found was apartment 3G in the Penrith building. The Penrith wasn't so much a building as it was a testament to architectural stubbornness. It stood on a forgotten street corner, shouldering aside a vape shop on one side and a boarded-up laundromat on the other, its brick facade stained with decades of city grime and indifference. It had that distinct aura of forgotten grandeur, like a dowager queen fallen on hard times, still wearing her tarnished jewels. Online listings for units within were sparse and usually vanished quickly, snapped up by people, I presumed, in situations similar to my own. The rent for 3G was, to put it mildly, a miracle. Suspiciously so, but my bank account was singing a mournful dirge, and desperation, as they say, is the mother of profoundly questionable decisions. Mr. Gorman, the landlord, or more accurately, the entity whose name appeared on the lease agreement, was as elusive as a perfect credit score. Our entire transaction had been conducted via curt emails and a final slightly smudged envelope containing a single key, left for me under the cracked ceramic pot housing a dead fern in the Penrith's gloomy vestibule. There was no friendly handover, no tour of the amenities, which, as far as I could tell, consisted of a wheezing elevator that smelled of damp wool and regret, and a communal laundry room in the basement that I was already mentally preparing to avoid at all costs. Apartment 3G was compact. That was the charitable term. The previous tenant had clearly subscribed to the scorch and abandoned school of cleaning. A faint, unidentifiable odor, part old socks, part something vaguely metallic, clung to the air like a cheap shroud. The main room, which was to serve as my living room, bedroom, and dining area, boasted a single, large window overlooking a narrow alleyway that seemed to specialize in collecting discarded fast food containers and melancholic pigeons. The kitchenette was a cramped alcove with a sputtering tap and a stove that looked like it had personally witnessed the invention of fire. The bathroom, a tiny tile-lined box, was perhaps the bleakest corner of the whole affair. It was there, while attempting to scrub away a disturbing rust-colored stain from the inside of the medicine cabinet, that I found it. Tucked behind a loose panel at the back, almost invisible unless you were practically inside the cabinet, was a folded sheet of paper. It was old, the creases worn soft, the paper itself yellowed and brittle at the edges. The handwriting was small, incredibly neat, almost painstakingly precise, written in a faded blue ink. It was a list. My first thought was that it was some kind of inventory, or perhaps a set of passive-aggressive complaints left by a disgruntled former resident for the indifferent Mr. Gorman. But as I unfolded it carefully, the precise, almost clinical nature of the sentences sent a different kind of chill down my spine, one that had nothing to do with the bathroom's inherent dampness. It read, "Rules for occupancy. Apartment 3G, the Penrith building. 1. Never open the main room window after 11 p.m. No exceptions. Ensure it is securely locked before this time. 2. If you hear scratching sounds emanating from within the walls, play classical music immediately. Volume should be moderate, not jarring. Bach is generally effective. Avoid anything overly dissonant. 3. The woman residing in apartment 4B is not who or what she appears to be. Avoid interaction if possible. If unavoidable, be polite but disclose nothing personal. Do not accept any gifts from her, especially food or drink. 4. Do not answer the door after sundown unless you are absolutely certain of the visitor's identity and expecting them. Verbal confirmation through the closed door is insufficient. If in doubt, do not open. 5. You may, from time to time, hear singing from the water pipes, particularly in the bathroom. Ignore it. Do not attempt to listen closely, and under no circumstances should you hum, sing, or tap along to the melody. 6. Should a small, dark, and damp-looking stain manifest on the ceiling of the main room, typically near the center, vacate the apartment for a minimum of 3 hours. Do not look directly at the stain for any prolonged period before leaving. It will be gone upon your return. 7. Never leave food out overnight. This includes crumbs on countertops or unwashed dishes in the sink. They are perpetually hungry, and their attention is undesirable. 8. If the electric lights flicker rapidly 3 times in succession, immediately close your eyes and begin counting to 100, slowly and clearly. Do not open your eyes before reaching 100, regardless of any sounds or perceived activity in the room. 9. Report any persistent plumbing issues, especially leaks or blockages, to Mr. Gorman via written note only. Do not expect a swift response. Do not attempt repairs yourself beyond simple measures. 10. If you find small, unfamiliar objects arranged in patterns, pebbles, dust, dried insects, do not touch them. They will eventually disappear on their own. This is a form of communication. Do not attempt to reciprocate. I read the list twice, then a third time. My initial reaction was a bewildered sort of amusement. It had to be a prank. Some elaborate joke left by a tenant with a flair for the dramatic and too much time on their hands. The Penrith was old, undoubtedly quirky, but this was the stuff of student films and internet creepypastas. Scratching in the walls, a mysterious woman in 4B, singing pipes. It was absurd. Yet, the neatness of the handwriting, the specificity of the warnings, Bach is generally effective, minimum of 3 hours, lent it a strange sort of gravitas. It didn't feel like a joke scribbled in haste. It felt considered, experienced. I refolded the paper and tucked it back behind the loose panel, though not without a moment's hesitation. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to dismiss it as the ramblings of a lunatic. But another, smaller part, the part that had already noted the building's oppressive atmosphere and the strange silence of its hallways, urged me to keep it, just in case. It was, after all, a cheap studio. Perhaps this was the hidden cost. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, cleaning, and trying to make 3G feel less like a neglected evidence locker and more like a home. I bought a cheap rug to cover the worst of the floor stains, a second-hand lamp to combat the gloomy corners, and an impressive array of cleaning products that fought valiantly but ultimately only achieved a sort of armed truce with the apartment's resident grime. The work at the archive was demanding, mostly data entry and cross-referencing of digitized 18th and 19th century ledgers and correspondence. I'd come home exhausted, eat something quick, and fall into a restless sleep on the lumpy mattress I dragged up 3 flights of stairs. The building itself remained an enigma. I rarely saw other tenants. Occasionally, I'd hear muffled footsteps in the hallway or the groan of the ancient elevator, but direct encounters were scarce. The air in the common areas always seemed still, heavy, like it was holding its breath. There was a faint, persistent scent of dust and something else, something vaguely organic and sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot in a closed room. The window in the main room became an early point of contention, albeit a silent one, between me and the anonymous author of the rules. It was a large, sash-style window, painted shut in several places, but with enough give that I knew I could force it open with some effort. The alley it overlooked was perpetually shadowed, even at midday, and the main source of scenery was the graffitied brick wall of the adjacent building. Still, the apartment got stuffy, especially in the late afternoons. More than once, as evening drew in and the air thickened, I'd find myself eyeing that window, remembering the first rule: never open the main room window after 11 p.m. 11 p.m. Such a specific time. Why? What happened at 11:01? My rational mind scoffed. It was an old building, probably just a noise ordinance thing, or a local eccentric's quirky advice. But I didn't try to open it. Not yet. The scratching started on the 4th night. I was propped up in bed, which was really just my mattress on the floor in the corner I designated as the sleeping area, reading a dry but necessary tome on archival preservation techniques. It was quiet, the usual city hum muted by the Penrith's thick walls. Then I heard it, a faint, scritching sound. Like a mouse, I thought, or maybe a rat, given the building's apparent vintage. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind my head. I thumped the wall. The scratching stopped for a moment, then resumed, a little more insistent this time. Great, I thought. Pests. Add it to the list. I made a mental note to mention it to Mr. Gorman, though Rule 9 suggested that was a largely futile exercise. The scratching continued intermittently for the next hour. It was an annoying, unsettling sound, but I was determined to ignore it. Animals in the walls of old buildings were hardly supernatural. But then the nature of the scratching changed. It became less random, more rhythmic, a series of distinct, deliberate scrapes. Scrape, 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 pause, scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded less like an animal and more like fingernails, long fingernails, dragging slowly across old plaster and lath. A cold prickle went up my spine. I lowered my book. The room was suddenly very cold. The scratching intensified, moving along the wall, seeming to trace the outline of something. I remembered the second rule. If you hear scratching sounds emanating from within the walls, play classical music immediately. Volume should be moderate, not jarring. Bach is generally effective. Avoid anything overly dissonant. I didn't own any Bach. My musical tastes ran more towards indie rock and obscure electronic artists, but I had my phone and a streaming service. Feeling utterly ridiculous, like I was humoring a ghost, I searched for Johann Sebastian Bach. Cello suites seemed innocuous enough. I selected the first one, hit play, and placed my phone on the small, wobbly nightstand. The rich, sonorous notes of the cello filled the small apartment. The music was beautiful, melancholic, strangely calming despite the circumstances, and the scratching stopped. Not gradually, not fading away. It just ceased, abruptly, as if a switch had been flipped, the moment the music began to play. I sat there in the sudden silence, the cello, a lone, warm voice in the oppressive quiet of the Penrith. Coincidence? My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. The vibrations from the music, perhaps? Discouraging whatever small creature was making the noise? It was plausible, barely, but the sheer immediacy of it, the almost obedient cessation of the scratching, was deeply unsettling. I left the Bach playing for another hour before I finally drifted off to a troubled sleep, the image of that neat, precise handwriting on the yellowed paper vivid in my mind. My curiosity about apartment 4B and its mysterious occupant began to gnaw at me. Rule 3 was so specific. The woman residing in apartment 4B is not who or what she appears to be. What did that even mean? Was she dangerous, mentally unstable, a master of disguise? The floor plan of the Penrith was simple enough. 4B would be directly above 3B, which was adjacent to me. So, her apartment was likely not directly overhead, but close. For the next few days, I found myself listening for sounds from that direction. The Penrith wasn't exactly soundproof. I could hear the tenant in 3F above me pacing occasionally, the distant flush of a toilet from somewhere down the hall. But from the vicinity of 4B, there was mostly silence. An unnerving, watchful silence. One afternoon, as I was leaving for a late shift at the archive, I saw a woman locking the door to 4B. She was of average height, with dark, neatly styled hair, perhaps in her late 40s or early 50s. She wore a simple, tasteful dress, and her movements were composed, elegant even. She looked utterly normal. If anything, she looked a little out of place in the Penrith, like someone who had taken a wrong turn and ended up in a far less salubrious establishment than she was accustomed to. She turned as I approached, and a polite smile touched her lips. Her eyes, though, were a peculiar shade of pale gray, almost translucent, and they seemed to fix on me with an intensity that was slightly unnerving. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice soft, cultured. "You must be the new resident in 3G. Her knowledge of my specific apartment number, when I hadn't even seen her before, was a small jolt. But then, in a building this small, news probably traveled, however slowly. "Yes, that's me," I replied, trying for a casual tone. "Just moved in a few days ago." "Welcome to the Penrith," she said. Her smile widened a fraction, but it didn't quite reach those pale, watchful eyes. "I'm Eleanor, from 4B. She extended a hand. Her handshake was firm, her skin cool to the touch. "I'm Alex," I offered. "Alex," she repeated, as if tasting the name. "It's good to have some fresh energy in the building. It can be a rather quiet place." There was something in the way she said, "quiet," that made it sound less like a descriptor and more like a warning. I remembered the rule: avoid interaction if possible. If unavoidable, be polite but disclose nothing personal. Do not accept any gifts from her, especially food or drink. Well, it's certainly characterful, I managed, already feeling the need to extricate myself. I should get going, actually. Late for work. Of course, Eleanor said, her smile unwavering. Perhaps we'll have a chance to chat properly some other time. It's always nice to know one's neighbors. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than was comfortable before she turned and glided towards the wheezing elevator. I watched her go, a strange sense of unease settling in my stomach. She seemed perfectly pleasant, polite, well-spoken, normal. So why did the rule exist? Not who or what she appears to be. What lay beneath that composed exterior? That night, the temptation to open the window was stronger than ever. The apartment felt suffocating, not just from the lingering summer heat, but from the accumulated weight of unspoken questions and creeping anxieties. I stood before it just before 11, my hand hovering over the rusted latch. The alley below was a pit of blackness, the usual city sounds seeming distant, distorted. I imagined a cool breeze, a breath of fresh air. What could possibly be the harm? Then, from the street below, not the alley, I heard a sound. A low, guttural cry, almost animalistic. It was brief, cut off sharply, followed by a sudden, heavy silence. My hand recoiled from the latch as if it had been burned. I checked my watch. 10:50, 8 p.m. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering. I locked it, checking the mechanism twice, even though I hadn't unlocked it in the first place. The rule, clear and precise in my mind: never open the main room window after 11 p.m., no exceptions. Perhaps it wasn't just about what might come in, perhaps it was about what you might see, or what might see you. The list of rules, once a source of skeptical amusement, was rapidly becoming a survival guide. And I was beginning to suspect that survival in the Penrith building was a far more complex and precarious undertaking than I could have ever imagined. The cheap rent, I was starting to understand, came with a very steep price. My initial sense of having found a bargain was curdling into a distinct, chilling premonition that I had, in fact, been found by something else entirely. The faint, metallic odor in 3G suddenly seemed more sinister, less like old pipes, and more like old blood, and the silence of the Penrith, once merely Zillow, now felt predatory. The following week was a tightrope walk of adherence and observation. Each rule on that yellowed paper had transformed from a curious eccentricity into a vital commandment, the breaking of which, I was becoming increasingly convinced, would carry immediate and unpleasant consequences. My life in apartment 3G began to revolve around them, a strange liturgy of self-preservation. The singing in the pipes started on a Tuesday morning. I was in the bathroom, the tiny space still steamy from a quick, lukewarm shower. It began subtly, a faint, high-pitched hum that seemed to resonate through the copper piping. At first, I thought it was just the water heater, or some pressure fluctuation. But then, a melody emerged, a surprisingly sweet and clear tune, almost like a child's lullaby, yet with an underlying current of something ancient and mournful. It was strangely alluring. I found myself pausing, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, listening. The melody was simple, repetitive, and I felt a bizarre urge to hum along, to match its eerie cadence. Ignore it. Do not attempt to listen closely, and under no circumstances should you hum, sing, or tap along to the melody. Rule 5. The words flashed in my mind, sharp and insistent. I forced myself to resume brushing my teeth, a little too vigorously, the sound of the bristles scraping against enamel, a deliberate act of defiance against the insidious tune. For a moment, as if sensing my resistance, the melody faltered, became discordant, a jarring screech of notes that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it faded, leaving only the dripping of the faucet and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I leaned against the sink, shaken. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like a presence, something that had reached out and been rebuffed. The door rule was tested that Friday night. I was home from the archive, trying to lose myself in a particularly dense file on 19th century zoning disputes, a task that normally guaranteed mental oblivion. It was well after 10, the city outside a distant roar. A sharp, distinct knock echoed from my apartment door. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. My social circle in this new city was, to put it mildly, non-existent. Rule 4. Do not answer the door after sundown unless you are absolutely certain of the visitor's identity and expecting them. Verbal confirmation through the closed door is insufficient. Who is it? I called out, my voice betraying a tremor I hadn't intended. Silence for a beat. Then, a woman's voice, soft and a little shaky. Hello? It's Eleanor. From 4B. I'm so sorry to bother you this late, but my kitchen light just went out, and I seem to have blown a fuse. I was wondering if you might have a spare, or could perhaps take a look. I'm afraid I'm not very good with these things. Eleanor. My stomach tightened. Her voice sounded mostly like Eleanor, but there was a subtle inflection, a slightly too breathy quality that hadn't been there during our hallway encounter. Or was I imagining it, paranoid? I don't think I have any spare fuses. I lied, my eyes darting towards the peephole, then remembering the rule's addendum. Verbal confirmation through the closed door is insufficient. What would the peephole show me? Eleanor, or something pretending to be her? Oh, her voice was laden with disappointment, perhaps a hint of something else. Well, perhaps you could just take a quick look? I really don't want to call Mr. Gorman at this hour. You know how he is. She did have a point about Gorman, but the insistence, the way she was trying to coax me. I'm really not comfortable, Eleanor, I said, trying to keep my voice firm. I'm not an electrician. Maybe try in the morning? There was a longer silence this time. Then, the voice changed, losing its soft, helpless quality. It became flat, cold, a pity. Just that. 2 words. Then, the distinct sound of footsteps, unhurried, receding down the hallway. I waited a full 5 minutes, listening, before I dared to breathe properly again. Had it been her? Or was Eleanor a convenient guise for something else that roamed the Penrith's halls after dark? The ambiguity was terrifying. Not who or what she appears to be. The rule seemed to cover so much more than just a peculiar neighbor. The food rule was, thankfully, easier to follow, though it bred its own kind of paranoia. I became meticulous about cleaning, scrubbing every crumb, triple-checking the sink for stray particles before bed. One morning, however, I found I'd missed a tiny sliver of dried pasta that had fallen beside the waste bin. It was gone. In its place, on the grimy linoleum, were 3 small, perfectly round pebbles, arranged in a tight triangle. They were smooth, dark gray, like river stones, though how they'd gotten into my 3rd-floor apartment was a mystery. Rule 10. If you find small, unfamiliar objects arranged in patterns, do not touch them. They will eventually disappear on their own. This is a form of communication. Do not attempt to reciprocate. Communication. What were they trying to say? Thank you? A warning? The pebbles were gone by the time I returned from work, leaving no trace, no explanation. Just a lingering sense of being observed by something unseen, something with meticulous, unsettling habits. The ceiling stain appeared on a gray, drizzly Sunday afternoon. I was trying to read, but the oppressive atmosphere of the apartment was making concentration impossible. I glanced up, and there it was. A small, dark patch on the stained ceiling, roughly in the center of the room. It was about the size of my palm, irregular in shape, and it looked wet, as if water were slowly seeping through the plaster from the apartment above. Rule 6. Should a small, dark, and damp-looking stain manifest on the ceiling, vacate the apartment for a minimum of 3 hours. Do not look directly at the stain for any prolonged period before leaving. My first instinct was to grab a bucket, to investigate. Old buildings, leaky pipes, it made sense. But the rule was specific. Do not look directly at it. I had already stared at it for a good 10 seconds. I forced my gaze away, a strange reluctance coiling in my gut. The stain pulsed, or seemed to, in my peripheral vision. It felt wrong. Not just a leak. Feeling foolish, but also profoundly uneasy, I grabbed my keys and wallet and left. I walked aimlessly through the damp city streets for what felt like an eternity. The image of that dark blotch seared into my mind. I ended up in a sterile, brightly lit coffee shop, nursing a lukewarm latte for well over the prescribed 3 hours, the normal chatter and clatter of the place feeling like a different universe from the silent, watching rooms of the Penrith. When I finally returned, my heart thudding with a mixture of dread and trepidation, the stain was gone. The ceiling was exactly as it had been before, discolored, certainly, but uniformly so. There was no mark, no lingering dampness, no evidence that the ominous blotch had ever existed. It was as if the building itself had inhaled it. The incident with the flickering lights was perhaps the most overtly terrifying. It happened late one night, as I was preparing for bed. I'd just switched off my reading lamp, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the sickly orange glow from the streetlight filtering through the grimy window. Suddenly, the main overhead light, which I rarely used due to its flickering tendencies, flashed on, then off, then on, then off, then on a third time and stayed off. 3 rapid, deliberate flickers. Rule 8. If the electric lights flicker rapidly 3 times in succession, immediately close your eyes and begin counting to 100, slowly and clearly. Do not open your eyes before reaching 100, regardless of any sounds or perceived activity in the room. My blood ran cold. Instinct, or perhaps the ingrained terror the rules were instilling in me, took over. I squeezed my eyes shut, so tightly I saw spots, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. The silence in the room was absolute for the first 10 seconds. Then I heard it. A soft, dry rustling, like old leaves skittering across a wooden floor. It was inside the apartment with me. My breath hitched. I wanted to scream, to open my eyes, to bolt. But the rule was explicit. Do not open them, no matter what you hear. 27, 28. My voice was a choked whisper. A faint, musky odor filled the air, the same scent I sometimes noticed in the Penrith's hallways, but stronger now, more concentrated. Then came a whisper, right beside my ear, so close I could feel a puff of what felt like cold, dead air against my skin. The voice was sibilant, ancient, speaking words I couldn't understand, words that slid into my mind like icicles. Terror, stark and absolute, seized me. My body trembled, every instinct screaming at me to open my eyes, to confront whatever it was. But the memory of the precise, unwavering handwriting on that list, the sheer conviction behind those rules, held me paralyzed, counting through clenched teeth. 61, 62. Something brushed against my leg, lightly, deliberately. I flinched violently but kept my eyes shut. The whispering continued, circling me, seeming to probe for a weakness, a flicker of an eyelid. I could hear faint, almost inaudible clicks, like tiny insectile mandibles, and a soft, wet dragging sound, as if something heavy and damp was being pulled across the floorboards. 928, 929, 100. I held my breath, then slowly, tentatively, opened my eyes. The room was empty. The oppressive silence had returned, broken only by my own ragged breathing. The musky odor was fainter now, almost gone. There was no sign of anything amiss, nothing out of place. It was as if the entire terrifying episode had been a hallucination, a product of an overactive imagination fueled by sleeplessness and fear. But I knew it hadn't been. The cold dread lingering in the air was real. The phantom touch on my leg was real. My encounters with Eleanor, the woman from 4B, became slightly more frequent, though always brief, always unsettling. I'd see her in the hallway, or by the mailboxes in the vestibule. She was always polite, her smile perfectly calibrated, her pale eyes watchful. She asked innocuous questions, how I was settling in, if I found the building quiet enough, if I needed anything. Each question felt like a delicate probe, an attempt to glean information. One afternoon she caught me as I was heading out. "Alex, dear," she said, her voice like honeyed silk. "I baked far too many muffins this morning, apple and cinnamon. Would you care for one? As a little welcome to the building gesture." She held out a small plate, covered with a napkin. On it sat 2 perfectly formed, golden brown muffins. They smelled delicious. My stomach rumbled. I hadn't eaten much that day, but Rule 3 was a flashing red light in my brain. Do not accept any gifts from her, especially food or drink. "That's so kind of you, Eleanor," I said, trying to inject warmth into my voice. while my insides twisted with anxiety. "But I'm actually on my way to meet a friend for lunch." I couldn't possibly. It was a clumsy lie, but the best I could manage. Her smile didn't falter, but something flickered in those pale eyes. A glint of, what, disappointment? Or something colder, more calculating? "Another time, perhaps," she said smoothly, withdrawing the plate. "It's a shame to let them go to waste." She paused, then added, "You seem a little tense, Alex. Are you sleeping well?" The Penrith can take some getting used to. Her ability to zero in on my unease was uncanny. "I'm fine," I said, perhaps a little too sharply. "Just busy with work. Thanks again for the offer." I practically fled down the stairs, not daring to use the elevator in case she decided to join me. Not who or what she appears to be. The words echoed in my mind. What was she? A lonely woman trying to be neighborly? Or something far more sinister, cloaked in a veneer of normalcy? Her apartment, 4B, loomed large in my thoughts. What secrets did it hold? Was she the source of some of the building's strangeness, or merely another one of its trapped inhabitants, albeit one with a unique role? I tried to rationalize. The scratching was rats, definitely. The singing pipes, just old plumbing. The door knock, a genuine mistake, maybe by a confused tenant. The flickering lights, faulty wiring, Eleanor, just an eccentric neighbor. My mind desperately sought mundane explanations, clinging to the familiar shores of logic in a sea of encroaching weirdness. But the explanations felt increasingly flimsy, tattered things against the consistent, chilling accuracy of the rules. Each event, each narrow adherence, chipped away at my skepticism, replacing it with a gnawing, pervasive dread. The Penrith building was not just an old, run-down apartment block. It was something else. Something that was alive, aware, and operating under a set of laws far removed from any municipal code or tenant agreement. The list in my bathroom cabinet was not a prank. It was a lifeline, a fragile set of instructions for navigating a place where the ordinary rules of reality had been subtly, terrifyingly suspended. And I was beginning to fear that the window, the one I was forbidden to open after 11 p.m., wasn't just a window, it was a boundary, and I had no idea what lay on the other side, waiting for the dark. My isolation felt less like a consequence of my solitary job and more like a carefully managed condition orchestrated by the building itself. I was a specimen in a jar, and the rules were the only thing keeping the lid on tight. The strain was beginning to tell. Sleep offered little respite, filled with fractured dreams of scratching claws, pale eyes, and endless, twisting hallways. My work at the archive suffered. Concentration became a monumental effort. I found myself jumping at sudden noises, scrutinizing shadows, constantly feeling like I was on the verge of some dreadful revelation. The apartment, my supposed sanctuary, had become a cage, its bars forged from fear and arcane regulations. One evening, driven by a growing desperation, I almost broke the window rule. It was a sweltering night, the air in 3G thick and stagnant. The alley below was a dark, uninviting maw, but the thought of a cool breeze, any breeze, was almost overpoweringly seductive. I found myself standing before it at 10:55 p.m., my hand on the latch. Just for a minute, what could 1 minute hurt? As my fingers tightened, ready to force the warped wood, I heard a sound from directly outside the glass, not from the alley floor, but from level with the window itself. A soft, wet inhalation, as if something large were pressed right up against the pane, breathing. Then, a single, impossibly long fingernail, yellowed and curved like a talon, drew a slow, deliberate line down the grimy glass, leaving a thin, clean streak in its wake. It was accompanied by a sigh, a sound of profound, patient hunger. I stumbled back, a choked cry dying in my throat. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. There was nothing visible through the grimy pane but the darkness of the alley and the brick wall beyond. But I had seen it. I knew I had. I scrambled away from the window, my body trembling. I didn't check the lock. I didn't need to. The image of that nail, that sigh, was burned into my retinas. Whatever was out there, it knew about the window. It was waiting, and the rule was not a suggestion. It was a shield against something that desired entry with a terrifying, palpable intensity. The Penrith was actively trying to keep things out, or perhaps keep me in, for reasons I couldn't fathom, but was beginning to dread discovering. The neatly written list was not just advice from a previous tenant. It felt like the distilled wisdom of generations of survivors, each rule paid for in terror, or worse. The carefully constructed dam of my rationalizations finally broke. There were no more coincidences, no more mundane explanations. Apartment 3G was a nexus of the uncanny, and I was trapped within its influence. The only way out, I suspected, was not through the front door. The question that now consumed me was, who wrote those rules, and what happened to them? Were they a survivor who had managed to escape? Or were they a victim, their final act a desperate warning scrawled before the Penrith claimed them utterly? The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through me. I had to know more. I had to understand what I was up against, or I would undoubtedly become just another forgotten story in the Penrith's long, dark history. My focus shifted from merely surviving the rules to actively investigating their origin and the history of the malevolent entity that seemed to animate the very bricks and mortar around me. This building wasn't just haunted, it was a predator, and the rules were the only teeth I had. The turning point, the moment raw fear solidified into a desperate need for answers, came with the partial, terrifying breach of a rule. It was the scratching again, Rule 2. I'd been working late at the archive, a particularly grueling session involving water-damaged 18th century parish records, their spidery script almost illegible. I'd returned to 3G exhausted, my mind still fuzzy with faded ink and forgotten names. I'd forgotten to queue up my Bach playlist before collapsing into bed. The scratching began around 3 a.m., more aggressive than before, less tentative. It sounded like dozens of sharp points, working in unison, digging, tearing. I jolted awake, disoriented. For a fatal few seconds, I couldn't place the sound, my sleep-fogged brain struggling to connect it to the neat script of the rule. By the time I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, the scratching had reached a frenzied pitch. It wasn't just in one spot anymore. It seemed to be coming from all four walls simultaneously, a chorus of relentless, destructive hunger. As I finally managed to tap the play icon for the cello suites, a large section of wallpaper directly opposite my bed, ancient and patterned with faded, indeterminate flowers, began to bulge outwards. It stretched, rippled, the paper tearing with a sound like dry canvas ripping. For a horrifying instant, I thought the wall itself was about to give way. Then, as the first notes of Bach filled the room, the bulging subsided, almost with a sigh of frustration. The scratching ceased instantly. But a long, jagged tear remained in the wallpaper, revealing the dark, crumbling plaster beneath. It looked like a wound. I lay there, rigid, staring at the torn wallpaper, the cello's somber tones, a fragile barrier against whatever lay just beyond the plaster. It had been close, too close. Forgetting the music hadn't just resulted in more scratching, it had provoked a physical attempt to breach the room. What would have happened if I'd been a few seconds later with the music? What would have come through? The next morning, the tear was still there, a stark reminder of my lapse. The building didn't heal itself, not always. Sometimes, it bore its scars, and it made me wonder about the scars it might leave on its inhabitants. My interactions with Eleanor from 4B also escalated, moving from subtly unnerving to overtly intrusive. A few days after the wallpaper incident, I was returning from a rare grocery run when I found her standing outside my door, apparently examining the lock. She turned as I approached, her smile a little too bright, a little too fixed. "Alex, dear," she said, her voice smooth as ever. "I was just noticing your door. It seems a bit loose on its hinges. Are you having any trouble with it?" My door was perfectly fine. I'd checked it meticulously, like everything else in 3G. "No, Eleanor, it's fine," I said, my hand tightening on my grocery bag. "Thanks for your concern." "Oh, good." She didn't move. "I only mention it because security is so important, isn't it? In a building like this." Her pale eyes flickered over me, then to the door again. One never knows who or what might be trying to get in. The emphasis she put on what was chilling. "I manage," I said, trying to edge past her to unlock my door. She stepped aside, but only slightly. As I fumbled with my key, she leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You know, Alex, I have some rather interesting old books about the history of this area. Some of them even mention the Penrith. You seem like someone who appreciates history. Perhaps you'd like to borrow them sometime. An offer of information, directly related to the building. It was tempting, dangerously so. But it also felt like a trap. Rule 3. Avoid interaction if possible. Do not accept any gifts from her. Were books considered gifts? Was information? That's very kind of you, Eleanor, I said, finally getting the key to turn. But my work at the archive keeps me buried in historical documents as it is. I don't think I have the spare time. Her smile thinned. A shame. Some knowledge is best acquired, informally. She paused. Be careful, Alex. Not all closed doors stay locked. With that cryptic pronouncement, she turned and glided away towards 4B, leaving me with a profound sense of unease. Her attempt at appearing helpful felt like a carefully veiled threat, her offer of books a poisoned apple. It was clear I couldn't rely on simply following the rules anymore. They were a defense, yes, but a passive one. Whatever resided in the Penrith was learning, adapting, testing my adherence. I needed to understand the nature of the threat, its history, its weaknesses, if any. The torn wallpaper was a clear sign that the integrity of my sanctuary was failing. My investigation began online. The Penrith building, its address, any associated names. Initial searches yielded very little. Old property records, a few faded advertisements from decades past when it was perhaps a more reputable residence. There were no dramatic news stories, no publicized crimes or tragedies directly linked to the name. It was strangely, unnervingly anonymous for a building so old and imposing. Then I started cross-referencing with local historical society databases, looking for mentions of the street, the block. I widened my search terms. Unexplained disappearances, strange occurrences, local folklore tied to the specific district. That's when the first threads began to appear. Vague accounts, mostly from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, of the area being unlucky or unwholesome. Mentions of a previous structure on the same site, something that burned down under mysterious circumstances. Whispers of tenants in the newly built Penrith. It was erected in the early 1900s, I discovered, who suffered from melancholia or nervous afflictions, who left abruptly or were removed. The city's main library had an extensive archive of old newspapers on microfilm. I started spending my lunch breaks and hours after work hunched over the readers, scrolling through decades of local news. It was painstaking, eye-straining work. I found a small, buried article from 1927, Tenant missing from Penrith Arms. So it had once been called the Penrith Arms. A Mr. Alistair Finch, a reclusive gentleman of scholarly habits, had vanished from his apartment. No sign of struggle, no note. He had simply ceased to be. His apartment number wasn't mentioned. Another piece, from 1954, brief fire at Penrith Apartments. A minor incident, contained to one unit, cause undetermined. The tenant, a Miss Eliza Bloom, suffered smoke inhalation but recovered. She moved out shortly thereafter. Again, no apartment number. These were isolated incidents, perhaps, coincidences, but the sheer age of the Penrith and the persistence of these small, unsettling stories began to paint a picture. This wasn't a recent haunting. This was something ingrained, ancient. I tried to find information on previous tenants of 3G specifically. This was much harder. Rental records, if Mr. Gorman even kept them properly, were not public. I considered trying to contact him to feign a plumbing issue as per Rule 9 and then subtly inquire. But my last attempt to discuss anything serious with him via email, a polite query about the malfunctioning radiator before the weather turned cold, had been met with a 2-word reply. Is tolerable. Gorman was a dead end. The rules themselves became a focus of my research. Who could have written them? The precise handwriting, the calm, methodical tone, suggested an educated, organized mind. Someone like Alistair Finch, the reclusive gentleman of scholarly habits, or perhaps someone who had survived an encounter, like Eliza Bloom, and felt compelled to leave a warning. The paper was old. It could have been there for decades. I examined the list again, more closely. The ink was faded blue. I wasn't an expert, but it looked like fountain pen ink. The paper stock was thick, creamy, not something you'd find in a cheap notepad today. This list was old, perhaps 50, 60 years old, maybe more. One phrase from the rules particularly bothered me. They are perpetually hungry. They, plural. This implied multiple entities, or multiple manifestations of a single one. The scratching, the singing, the stain, the presence during the light flickering. Were these all different aspects of the Penrith's malevolence? And Eleanor from 4B, was she one of them, or something else entirely, a human collaborator, or a uniquely adapted victim? My job at the archive, cataloging the city's minutiae, suddenly felt like a training ground. I was used to sifting through forgotten records, looking for patterns, for connections. I started applying that same methodology to the Penrith. I created a timeline, cross-referencing the rules with my own experiences and the sparse historical data. Rule 3. The woman residing in apartment 4B is not who or what she appears to be. I searched for any records related to 4B, nothing specific. But I did find an old architectural drawing of the Penrith's original floor plan in a city planning archive. Apartment 4B was larger than the others on that floor. It had an unusual layout, with a room that had no windows indicated, a dark room at the heart of the building. Rule 7. Never leave food out. They are perpetually hungry. This, combined with Rule 10 about the small objects left in patterns, suggested something that scavenged, that observed, that communicated in its own alien way. Not ghosts in the traditional sense. Something more primal. The library had a local history section, full of dusty, self-published books and pamphlets about the city's older districts. In one particularly obscure volume, Forgotten Corners of Elm Street Ward, I found a chilling passage. It didn't name the Penrith directly, but described a building on its street corner known in local folklore as the Hungry House. The author, a local amateur historian from the 1960s, wrote, "It is said by some old folk that the very land upon which it stands is soured, that it was a place of ill omen long before the bricks were laid. They say the house itself developed a taste for the lives within it, not in a violent manner, but through a slow, steady attrition, a drawing out of vitality, of sanity. Residents would grow pale, withdrawn, and eventually they would simply fade or be taken. And sometimes, it is whispered, the house chooses one to be its voice, its lure, a friendly face to draw in the unwary. A friendly face to draw in the unwary. Eleanor. The description fit her unnervingly well. Was she the voice of the Penrith? Was 4B her den? The most disturbing discovery came from an unexpected source. I had started, cautiously, to ask around at the archive, feigning a casual interest in urban legends for a personal project. Most of my colleagues were uninterested, but one older archivist, a woman named Martha who had worked there for 40 years, grew quiet when I mentioned the Penrith street. "The Penrith," she said, her voice low, her eyes distant. "My grandmother used to tell stories about that building, said it was bad ground. She had a friend, a girl named Clara, who took a room there in the 30s. A pretty, lively girl. After a few months, Clara stopped visiting. When my grandmother went to check on her, the landlord, a different Gorman then, probably this one's father or grandfather, they've always been Gormans there, like a dynasty of caretakers for that cursed place, said Clara had moved out. No forwarding address, just gone." Martha looked at me then, her gaze sharp. My grandmother never believed it. She said Clara wouldn't have left without a word. She said the Penrith ate her. She paused. "There was a list, you know, or so the stories went. A list of things you mustn't do, passed down by those who stayed a while and learned. Most didn't stay long enough to need it, or to add to it. A list, passed down. The yellowed paper in my bathroom cabinet wasn't just a list, it was the list. A living document, a testament to generations of fear and hard-won knowledge. And the Gormans, they were complicit, keepers of the trap. The cheap rent wasn't an oversight, it was bait. I felt a profound, chilling connection to the anonymous author of those rules. They weren't just a stranger, they were a predecessor, someone who had walked these same floors, felt this same dread, fought this same battle. What had been their fate? Had they escaped, leaving the list as their legacy? Or had the Penrith finally claimed them, the list their final, desperate message in a bottle? The nature of the threat was becoming clearer, if no less terrifying. It wasn't a simple haunting. The Penrith was an entity, or a host to entities, ancient and malevolent. It operated on a set of rules, its own internal logic. Eleanor was a part of it, perhaps its most sophisticated tool. The Gormans were its facilitators, and tenants like me, we were sustenance. Or perhaps, components in some larger, unseen mechanism. The investigation had armed me with knowledge, but that knowledge brought its own terror. I wasn't just fighting strange occurrences anymore. I was fighting the building itself, its history, its very essence. And the rules, while vital, felt increasingly inadequate. They were defensive. I needed to find a way to be proactive, to break the cycle, not just survive it. But how do you fight a building? How do you escape something that seems to control reality within its walls? The weight of this realization was immense, crushing. The Penrith wasn't just a place I lived, it was a place that was actively living off me. And time, I felt with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, was running out. The subtle wrongness had escalated to clear supernatural evidence, and now, direct, albeit still somewhat veiled, confrontation. The next phase, I feared, would be far worse. The breaking point arrived with a horrifying clarity, not in a cacophony of terror, but in a quiet, insidious tightening of the Penrith's grip. It began with the list itself. One morning, I went to consult it, a daily ritual now, a grim communion with my unknown predecessor, and found a new rule, neatly appended to the bottom in what looked disturbingly like my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. 11. Do not attempt to seek outside help regarding the building's true nature. Such attempts will be perceived as a breach of trust. The Penrith provides all that is necessary for its residents. My blood turned to ice. My handwriting, unmistakably. The ink was fresh. I hadn't touched the list, hadn't even taken it out of its hiding place, for days. The implications were staggering. The building wasn't just observing me, it was influencing me, perhaps even controlling my actions in ways I wasn't aware of. Had I written that rule in a fugue state, or had something guided my hand? The line between myself and the Penrith's influence was blurring. This new rule, this violation of my own agency, was a declaration. My attempts at research, my quiet defiance, had been noted. And now, the building was isolating me further, cutting off any imagined lifeline to the outside world. The thought of being trapped, not just physically but mentally, unable to trust my own actions or thoughts, was a new kind of horror. Then came Eleanor. She no longer bothered with the pretense of casual encounters. She knocked on my door one afternoon, not with a request for help, but with an air of quiet authority. I opened it a crack, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Alex," she said, her pale eyes holding mine. There was no smile now, just an unnerving placidity. "Mr. Gorman asked me to inform you that there will be a routine inspection of all units tomorrow, around midday. He trusts me to oversee things on this floor." Routine inspection? Gorman had never inspected anything. This was new. This was a direct result of my probing, or perhaps the building's escalating interest in me. Inspection for what? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just to ensure everything is in order," Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. "To make sure all tenants are comfortable and have everything they need." Her emphasis on need was chillingly reminiscent of the new rule. "It won't take long. Please ensure you are present." It wasn't a request, it was a summons, and I knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in my stomach, that this inspection would be anything but routine. It was a move, a play in the Penrith's long game, perhaps a test, perhaps an initiation, or perhaps something far more final. My research, which had felt like a small act of rebellion, now seemed like a goad that had provoked the beast. I had learned much about the Penrith's history, its patterns of disappearances, its predatory nature. I knew it fed, It communicated, it had its agents, but knowing was not enough. I was still subject to its rules, its power. Desperation clawed at me. Escape, that was the only answer. Not a quiet departure, breaking the lease and vanishing into the city. Rule 11 made it clear that wouldn't be tolerated, and I suspected the Penrith's reach extended further than its physical walls for those it had marked. I needed a true escape, a severing. But how? The building felt sentient, its surveillance total. My mind raced, sifting through everything I'd learned. The rules, the historical accounts, Martha's story, the hungry house folklore. There had to be a loophole, a weakness. The rules themselves, they were a form of control, but also a kind of agreement, a set of parameters. What if one rule could be used against another, or against the building itself? The window. Rule 1. Never open the main room window after 11 p.m. It was the most emphatic, the most absolute of the primary rules. What was so terrible about that window after that specific hour? I had seen the talon-like nail, heard the breathing. Something waited out there. But what if that something was not aligned with the Penrith's internal agenda? What if it was an outside force, something the Penrith itself feared or sought to control? It was a wild, terrifying gamble. The inspection was tomorrow. I had until then. If Eleanor, as the Penrith's agent, entered my apartment under the building's authority, I would be completely vulnerable. I had to act before then, tonight. My plan, if it could be called that, was born of sheer terror and a sliver of desperate hope. The rules were designed to keep me safe within the system. But what if the only way out was to break the most fundamental rule, to invite chaos, hoping that in the ensuing pandemonium, I could slip through the cracks? As evening deepened, the Penrith seemed to hum with a malevolent anticipation. The air grew thick, the usual city sounds fading into an oppressive silence. I checked the lock on my door a dozen times. I barricaded it with my flimsy chair, a gesture I knew was laughably inadequate. The scratching in the walls began earlier than usual, around 9 p.m., more frantic, more widespread. I put on the Bach, the cello's voice sounding thin and fragile against the rising tide of unseen hunger. The singing in the pipes joined in, a chorus of eerie, seductive melodies weaving through the music. It felt like the building was marshaling its forces, aware of my rebellious thoughts, my desperate intent. At 10:30 p.m., the lights flickered. Once, twice. I tensed, waiting for the third. It came. Flicker. My eyes snapped shut. 1, 2, 3. I began to count, the familiar ritual now overlaid with a new, frantic urgency. The sounds in the room started almost immediately. The rustling, the whispers, closer this time, more insistent. Something cold touched my cheek. I flinched but kept counting, my voice trembling. The musky odor was overpowering. This is it, I thought. They know. They're trying to stop me opening my eyes, to break me before I can act. 99. 100. I gasped, forcing my eyes open. The room was empty, the air still vibrating with unseen energies. But the clock on my phone read 10:58 p.m. I had minutes. I scrambled to the main window. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the rusted latch. The alley below was a pit of impenetrable blackness. The air outside felt charged, electric. I could hear that soft, wet inhalation again, right up against the glass, patient, waiting. Never open the main room window after 11 p.m., no exceptions. My phone screen glowed, 10:59 p.m. This wasn't just about breaking a rule, this was about inviting something in, something the Penrith itself had forbidden, a hostile witness, or perhaps a rival predator. The final seconds ticked by. My heart was a wild drum against my ribs. I thought of the neat handwriting on the list, the generations of fear it represented. I thought of Alistair Finch, of Clara, of all the others who had vanished into the Penrith's insatiable maw. 11:00 p.m. With a strangled sob, a mixture of terror and defiance, I threw all my weight against the sash. The wood groaned, splintered, the paint seal cracked. The window slid upwards, a screech of protesting metal and wood. A blast of air hit me, but it wasn't cool or fresh. It was frigid, carrying a scent of ancient dust, of decay, and something else something indescribably alien, like ozone and open graves. The alley below was no longer an alley. For a horrifying, eternal moment, reality itself seemed to tear. The familiar brick wall opposite my window dissolved, writhed, became a roiling canvas of shifting, impossible geometries, lit by a sickly, pulsing luminescence that emanated from no discernible source. Shapes moved within that chaos, things with too many limbs, too many eyes, things that defied any sane description. It was a glimpse into a place that should not be, a place outside of time and space, a raw, screaming void. And from that void, something was looking back. Not the relatively contained horrors of the Penrith, but something vaster, older, infinitely more terrifying. A presence of cosmic scale, its attention drawn by the opened window, the broken seal. A sound ripped through the night, a sound that was not a sound, but a pressure, a psychic scream that vibrated in my bones, in my teeth. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated horror and recognition. From behind me, in the apartment, I heard a shriek. Not human. It was Eleanor's voice, but distorted, stretched, filled with an agony and a terror that dwarfed anything I had felt. The Penrith itself seemed to recoil. The scratching in the walls stopped abruptly. The singing in the pipes died in a strangled gurgle. The very air in the room thinned, grew brittle. Whatever was outside that window, the Penrith knew it, feared it. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. This was my chance. The building's attention, its power, was momentarily focused on the greater horror I had unleashed at its threshold. I spun from the window, ignoring the impossible vista, the soul-chilling presence. I tore the chair away from the door, my hands bloody from splinters, fumbled with the locks. The door swung open. The hallway was different. The usual gloom was still there, but it was charged with a new tension. I could hear sounds from other apartments, not the usual muffled noises, but cries of fear, of confusion. The Penrith's control was faltering. From 4B, directly above, came a series of hideous, tearing sounds, and a final, drawn-out scream from Eleanor that was cut off with sickening finality. Then, a wet, heavy thud. I didn't hesitate. I ran. Down the stairs, not daring the elevator. The building seemed to groan around me, the walls themselves flexing, the floorboards creaking like tortured souls. Shadows writhed in the corners of my eyes. The sweet, rotten fruit smell was everywhere, cloying, suffocating. As I reached the vestibule, the main door, usually so heavy, so forbidding, was slightly ajar. A sliver of the grimy dawn light from the street outside cut through the gloom. Hope, fragile and desperate, surged through me. I threw myself at the door, expecting resistance, expecting it to slam shut to trap me. But it yielded. I burst out onto the sidewalk, into the cold, damp morning air of the city, gulping it down like a drowning man. I didn't look back. I ran, blindly, for blocks. The impossible images from the window seared into my brain, the psychic scream still echoing in my skull. I didn't stop until I collapsed, gasping, on the steps of a silent, shuttered church several streets away. The city was waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled past. A few early commuters hurried by, casting curious glances at my disheveled state. The world looked normal, impossibly, blessedly normal. I never went back to the Penrith building. I abandoned everything. My clothes, my books, my meager possessions, my job at the archive. I couldn't. The thought of even approaching that street corner filled me with a visceral, paralyzing terror. I left the city that very day, on the first bus heading anywhere else. What happened at the Penrith after I opened that window? I don't know. Did the entity from the void cleanse it? Or did it merely interact with it, establishing some new, dreadful understanding? Was Eleanor truly gone? Or merely changed? Did the Penrith reclaim its authority once the window was, presumably, closed again by whatever forces resided there? Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls in a certain way, I think I can still feel that cold, alien pressure, hear that psychic scream. The memories are a brand on my soul. The world, for me, is no longer a place of solid, predictable realities. I know that thin places exist, places where the walls between worlds are worn down, where ancient things stir and watch. The Penrith was one such place. I often wonder about the list. Is it still there, behind the loose panel in the bathroom of 3G? Has a new tenant found it? Has someone, perhaps even the building itself, added a new rule? 12. Whatever you do not presume to understand the alliances or enmities of that which waits beyond the main room window. I try to live a normal life now, in a different city, under a different name. I avoid old buildings. I am meticulous about keeping my windows locked after dark, especially after 11 p.m. I play classical music, Bach mostly, far more often than my neighbors probably appreciate. And if I hear scratching in the walls, well, I move. Immediately. The Penrith building taught me that some doors are best left unopened, some knowledge is best left unknown. But it also taught me that sometimes the only way to escape a trap is to invite a monster to dinner, hoping it eats your jailer first. It's a desperate gamble, one I barely survived. I am forever looking over my shoulder, forever listening for the faint sound of singing in the pipes, forever changed by the neat, precise handwriting on a yellowed sheet of paper, and the terrible, cosmic truth it hinted at. The rent was cheap, yes, but the price was nearly everything, and even now, I'm not entirely sure I've finished paying it. The world is thin, and the Penrith, I suspect, has a long memory.